You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner. In this debate, we'll be discussing whether or not the British police force should routinely carry arms. A vigil has been held for the two female police officers shot dead in Manchester on the 18th of September. WPCs Fiona and Nicole Hughes, who were both unarmed, died from gunshot wounds in an attack still under investigation. Their deaths have renewed calls for the British police force to be routinely issued firearms. But those calls were countered by the Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg, who warned against any knee-jerk response to the tragedy. Mr Clegg said the move had considerable risks and could damage relations between police and the community. But the widower of another murdered WPC, Sharon Beshenivsky, says officers should carry firearms so they were prepared for any situation. In the last decade, fewer than 10 British police officers have been shot in the course of duty. Well, joining me for today's discussion is Charlie Wolfe, an American broadcaster who blogs for the Daily Mail. Ian Dunt is the editor of politics.co.uk. Joining us on the phone is Peter Squires, a professor of criminology and public policy at the University of Brighton and also a co-author of Shooting to Kill, Policing Firearms and Armed Response. And we're also joined by Maxim Popienka, a firearms expert from the website World Guns. Ian Dunn, editor of politics.co.uk. Should police officers be routinely armed?
No, very much not. I think we actually have an extremely fortunate situation in this country. We have very few firearms in the street. We actually have a very low homicide rate. It would be a tragedy for us to overreact to individual cases and to start destabilising that gunless society that Britain has. Really, when you don't have a population with very many guns, one of the problems, of course, when you give the police guns is they take on this much more oppressive image, and it adds up to a pretty unhealthy political environment.
And Charlie Wolfe?
I would disagree. I think not immediately. I couldn't see them issuing 10,000 handguns tomorrow to the entire force who haven't been trained and know how to handle them. But I think new incoming officers, as they are being trained, going to the police academy, the police training academy, they should be learning how to use firearms, and this should be slowly integrated in, because a policeman, as I would even argue a citizen, and I know that's not the discussion today, but should have the right to protect themselves, to have the tools available. When an assailant or someone they come into is armed, you don't have the time to wait for someone from the armed response unit to show up, or even again as a citizen, sometimes for the police to show up. You should be able to fight fire with fire when it is needed.
Maxim Popienka, firearms expert from the website World Guns.
Police should not be concerned about their image. They should be concerned first and most on their function, on the function of protecting people, especially from violent crimes. And violent people, violent criminals are not afraid of using firearms. So police must have adequate means to stop the criminals at any possible moment, not waiting for some special team to arrive, because wait would mean lost lives in most cases. You remember in British history there was event that actually started the chain of limitation in firearm ownership, and back in the start of the 20th century, a group of criminals, heavily armored criminals in London, held against unarmed British police. Actually, police officers had to borrow rifles and sidearms from average citizens to fight the criminals. And
we'll go to Peter Squires as well, the Professor of Criminology and Public Policy at the University of Brighton. What are your thoughts about whether police officers should be routinely issued firearms?
Well, I think the debate so far is quite bizarre. We've got two societies, representative of two societies, with much higher crime rates, with many more guns, much more violent gun crime, telling us we need to arm our police. And the last speaker has talked about a situation over 100 years ago. It's quite peculiar. First of all, no, I don't think the police should arm themselves. I think we have a very high standard of professionalism with the armed response units we currently have. If every officer were armed, I think we would dilute that expertise. Secondly, it would be be a massive investment in training at a time when the police budgets are under pressure. They can't afford to train all those officers to the level of specialism we currently have. Thirdly, the police don't want it. They don't think it's necessary. A recent poll of Police Federation members, 80% objected to the idea of routinely carrying arms. And finally, and the most important reason, we have an honourable tradition of policing by consent with the minimum use of force in this country, and we must protect that. The key to keeping guns out of the hands of the police is to reduce the numbers of guns in society at large. I speak that as a gun control commentator, and I don't think the American discourse of having more guns for supposed protection is a solution. We have a low rate of gun crime, we have an unarmed police, and that's a better way.
As low as your rate of crime is, if you're the guy who's in the shooting range or is in the line of fire, it doesn't matter what the statistics are for everybody else. As to the budgets, well, there's an argument that there are certain things, and I'm someone who doesn't, like a big government and doesn't like big government spending, but there's an argument that governments do have certain things that are within their remit, and I would suggest ensuring the safety of the community and the defense of others is part of their remit, and whatever it costs, and you just have to prioritize your budgets.
I don't disagree with you at all about the role of government ensuring security and public safety, but you don't do that by letting more guns in. I think that is the way to weapons proliferation in civil society. The more guns, the more gun crime, the more accidents, the more suicides.
This is one of the traditional arguments, isn't it, Ian Dunt from politics.co.uk, that if we start routinely arming police officers, criminals will be carrying more guns.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the numbers really speak for themselves. I mean, we actually have very few firearms incidents in the UK. I think it's about 11,000 in 2010, 2011, which includes all the replica rifles and guns that you see as well. So really, the number is very, very small. If you just you don't even need to compare with a society that's very advanced in gun ownership, like the United States. But even if you just look at Europe, where much looser regulations on guns, the police will carry guns, you're looking at quite an unfortunate situation that develops. For instance, so homicides per 100,000 of the population, 0.2 in Germany, compared to 0.73 here, 0.073. So massive distinctions once you allow violence to spread because the weapons are already proliferating in society. I don't know why Britain would ever take any lessons from any other countries as to why it would change itself. It seems to be a success story.
Well, I just don't fall for this argument you say allowing the violence to spread. A gun is an inanimate object. When it is used correctly, then it is not a weapon necessarily of violence. I mean, yes, it does violent things. I don't, I don't disagree there. But when it's being held responsibly by a policeman, or again, I would go further to say by a citizen using it responsibly and legally, it is not a threat. It is a method of self-defense.
I'm far less trusting, actually, in the police's ability to behave responsibly at all times. And if we look at, for instance, at the American example, what we see is an increase in the amount of violence and the aggressiveness that the police use because they become more disassociated from the population at large. And that's the real thing about policing by consent, picking police from the same community in which they serve and not giving them that many more weapons, not that many more powers than the average citizen, is you stop that split between police and normal public society that you get in other countries.
I think you have a bit more, and it's not to say, just very quick, I mean, just finish my point very quickly. Sure. It's not to say that there probably aren't instances of that in the United States, but I think you're getting more of a stereotype. Every little small town I've grown up in, every suburban town, the policemen were part of the community. They had guns. You didn't even really notice they had guns. Most officers will never unholster their weapon in their entire lifetime. But God forbid, if it's needed, it's an insurance policy that should be there to either save their lives or somebody else's.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner. Joining me is Charlie Wolf, an American broadcaster, Ian Dunt, the editor of politics.co.uk, Peter Squires, Professor of Criminology at Brighton University, and Maxim Popienka, a firearms expert. Maxim Popienka, let's bring you in here. Do you think it's an insurance policy that police officers should have?
It will happen again. Police will need arms to use. There will be a situation when use of force is necessary. And as long as no one has developed a teleportation or some other sort of instant movement of armed response unit to the place of crime, still be victims because of delays. Because even most professional, super trained and very well equipped team cannot move at the instant of the crime to the place where the experience and arms are needed. Guns are just tools to achieve some means. In this case, to stop violence, stop violent use. It doesn't matter if criminal is armed with firearm, with club, with Molotov cocktail. It doesn't actually matter.
But the thing is, at the moment, Maxim, in the UK, we've got armed police officers that are specialists, CO19 and other police officers, the ones you see in Heathrow Airport, that are specialists. They've been highly trained. If we started rolling out to every officer, wouldn't it be naive to expect we could have those high standards?
Well, you don't have to train every officer to high standards, because in most cases,
I beg your pardon. You don't train him to a high standard.
In very rare situations, such as hostage holdout or some high-profile crime. In most cases, the police officer needs a sidearm is for self-defense.
But you can't hand over a firearm to a police officer and not train them to a high standard.
That's not what he's saying.
Okay,
I mean, there are different levels of training.
I'll tell you from actual Russian statistics, from Russian police statistics. There's a number of cases that police use sidearms. They actually use sidearms, not with specialist arms like sniper rifles or assault rifles, just pistols. They use pistols to protect citizens only in about 5% cases. In about 20% cases, they use pistols in the course of apprehension of criminals during arrest. The rest is well over 50% cases. The police officers use pistols for self-defense, to protect themselves from a sudden, unexpected attack from criminal, during investigation, during routine police procedures, and so on. So you don't have to be a sniper, you don't have to be a tactical operator to use pistol in self-defense. It's actually quite limited scenario.
Peter Squires, you wanted to come in just then.
Yes, I mean, I think this is a ridiculous argument. We have specialist firearms officers that are trained to two very high levels of performance. And even then, we've had two incidents. We've had the shooting of Jean-Charles de Menezes in 2005, which created an absolute storm of protest about police lethal force being wrongly deployed. That was such a critical incident. And only last year we had the shooting of Mark Duggan in Tottenham, which led to riots across the whole country. These are massively controversial issues, and the police can get it wrong even when they're trained to a very high level. Now they deploy firearms officers something like 15,000 times. Only on a handful of occasions do they even shoot, and only on 2 occasions on average a year do they actually kill anybody. If you look at the distribution of bullets, even these highly trained officers only hit the target 50% of the time. So it shows how difficult and controversial this can be to allow a more liberal deployment. The police don't want it, it's not good for society, and the public don't need it.
Charlie Wolf.
I get it.
Maxim, let Charlie go first, and I'll come straight back to you.
Just a couple of things. I think when you're talking the de Menezes case, I mean, you have to admit that was very much a sui generis. That was under incredibly extreme circumstances. We'd only had a terrorist attack a couple of days or a week prior to that, and there was a failure of
where the courts themselves determined 35 errors by the armed response.
Yeah, but again, there was. I think that was a very exceptional case. But I also look at cases like I remember watching a documentary on Hungerford several years ago, and again, forgive me, the name of the shooter has escaped my mind. I'm sorry.
Michael Ryan.
Michael Ryan. Yes, thank you. And they had to send out someone from London, specially, and they then had sent him the wrong weapon and had to helicopter. So this man was sitting there twiddling his thumbs while Michael Ryan was on the loose.
But it's the old adage: hard, exceptional cases don't make good law. I don't think you make routine policy decisions in the context of incidents that happen once every 10 years. We would lose an awful lot. I know.
I agree, but I think I'm putting my Ryan up against your Domenech. Let's just say I'm putting my Ryan up against your Domenech's, or vice versa. And there just has to be. You think about these two police officers. All right, we're speculating here, but these two lady police officers last week, at least they could have had some last line of defense.
But actually, it would have done nothing to protect them. I mean, whether they had those guns or not, I mean, it would have done absolutely nothing. That's the thing that's really been lost in the way that this. Exactly, it was an ambush. You could have armed them to the hilt. Of course, they also had a grenade thrown at them. I mean, no one's saying let's arm the police with grenades when they routinely go to house calls. There's no case for saying that it would have prevented those deaths. And that's mostly the case with most police deaths. It wouldn't really have made all that much difference.
It's interesting that if you look, and again, this is slightly different, if you look at the mass shootings we've had in the States, I think out of the last 12, all but one were held in gun-free zones. And that made a major impact. There was definitely a causation. There was an association between the two. Again, there was not someone nearby that had the ability. And also, there's a further statement. I think that the criminals, knowing that the police are regularly armed, would think twice before attempting to do something like that.
Well, except that doesn't happen in the States at all, does it? I mean, you have one of the most violent societies in the Western world, really.
It's relatively, yes, but they're able to protect themselves. And there are many people that don't mess with the police because they know the police are an authority and they're armed.
I mean, certainly.
But to take another example, your recent New York example of the shooter near the Empire State Building, even the police officer shot passers-by. I mean, this argument that in the last case scenario we all need a gun falls down at the very first hurdle, because if we all need a gun, the criminals will just have as many as we do. There'll be more proliferation of firearms, more accidents, more crime, more deaths.
But Peter, there's an interesting choice.
Scenario poison the well.
Yeah, can I say there's an interesting choice though? I mean, we could either go your route or my route. We say the police are armed, and all right, yes, there was civilians that did get shot, but what's the alternative? Your route is they're not armed. And the sniper's now killing more people. There is no utopian situation, obviously.
No, but there's better public policy where we attempt to lower the rate of violence by reducing gun ownership, and we've generally been pretty successful of that in this country. Gun crime has come down the last 6 years. I know it's fallen in the States, but I don't think. But we've not had anything like the prevalence of gun spree incidents such as occurred in the cinema in Denver a couple of months ago. I mean that you have hundreds of those incidents. We have nothing like it.
I wouldn't say we have hundreds, but
I've got the figures in front of me.
But again, there is a point here when you break it out geographically. Where those things happen is where there are not legally held guns. This country, what you're saying to me, and again, I'll put it wider to not just the police but the citizenry. You're saying, I can't have a gun to protect myself because you want to keep guns out of society. Criminals don't care about keeping guns out of. If a criminal wants to get a weapon in this country, and granted at present it's low, but if they want to, they will.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner. Joining me is Charlie Wolf, an American broadcaster, Ian Dunt, the editor of politics.co.uk, Peter Squires, Professor of Criminology at Brighton University, and Maxim Popienka, a firearms expert. Maxim Popienka, firearms expert from the website World Guns.
Yes, I completely agree, because criminals are criminals because we don't care about the laws. They don't want to keep the law, and they don't care about society and their rules. And if you will keep police unarmed, you just must say openly to all your police officers, you guys are expendable. You, from time to time, will be killed by criminals who don't care about laws, who carry weapons, who have no respect for life. You will came into the dangers unarmed, and you can only pray that armed response team will be in time to save you, to bring you to the ambulance and to the hospital.
But then how do you explain the fact that British police don't want to have guns?
well. I think that it must be at least up to every officer to be able.
You can't just have a situation where officers have guns if they choose it. I mean, if the vast majority don't want them, they're not going to get them.
Well, the interesting thing, from what I hear, and I heard this secondhand from another expert, if you break this out into different areas, the places where there are high crimes, the Moss Sides, etc., the inner city areas, they actually do. The police bobby out in the country beat probably doesn't. But I think we have to take care of the ones that are facing crime every day.
The stats mentioned earlier, about 80%
I've
I've seen in several places, and certainly it goes from the bobbies that I've spoken to on the beat, and it goes all the way up to really at the top of ACPO and at the top of the Police Federation. This is straight out there, and there's very good reasons for it. Most of them are afraid of the fact that, you know, every time you shoot, you go off duty. God knows how long that takes. Others are worried about the new tests that would come in to be that they would have to pass in order to be able to carry the guns, and others, frankly, believe in the British system of policing that has served this country very well. So it does feel like the final test would rest with the police, and yet they are in completely the opposite persuasion to the one that you hold.
But their relatives are saying that this would save them. This would save the ones that have died if they were armed. Even the Police Federation, which represents the rank and file officers, say they want to have a 5% increase in armed officers.
Yeah, and it's true that often when you talk to relatives, you'll see calls for capital punishment or for police to be armed. I would suggest, and then this sounds almost cold, but it really isn't, is that, for instance, when we get a jury for a murder trial, we don't pick people who have been affected by the crime. Okay? And when someone's deeply connected to a situation, they are very emotional, they're subjective about it, and I would not suggest they're the ideal people to go to for advice. You go to offer sympathy and regret for what happened, but you don't go for them on advice on the future of gun policy, and I wouldn't suggest that we do it in this case either.
No, I mean, I agree to that extent, but not because the crime was committed against them, but the crime is committed against the state. The crime is actually committed against all of us. That's why when you see, I think it's the same here in the United Kingdom as it is in the United States, that when you, in a criminal case, it is the state versus so-and-so. And I agree, as I said earlier, I don't expect every officer on the beat now to have to go through a test. Came in under a different guise to be handed a pistol and says, here you go, or you have to train. But I do think we need to start integrating the training for future officers and at least even roll it out in the areas that need it. We are seeing more guns on the street, and no one seems to be running in fear. I walk into Heathrow and there's guys there with it's like submachine guns. It doesn't seem to frighten anybody. And I see more police in my little neck of the woods in North Finchley. I see more cops with arms. I don't think the public are that afraid of that they're swooning and fainting in the street over it. And I just think it's something that needs to be looked at. And sometimes we're living in this sort of halcyon utopia here, and we need to kind of get with the program of the modern day and say criminals are getting more dangerous and they're getting more armed, and we need to be able to match what they're doing.
But we have a falling rate of crime, of serious violent crime.
Let's bring in Professor Squires.
Sorry, I mean, I can see this idea that incremental arming is going to occur. There was a time in the 90s when people talked about arming the police as being an inevitable development because of rising gun crime and rising violence. I think that argument's turned. I think we've seen a fall over 5-6 years in gun crime. Violence rates are dropping. No one wants this now. I think we've turned a corner, and I think the argument that arming of the police is inevitable is a kind of symptom of the problem. What we have to work to do is to make it less necessary by more effective violence control, by more effective gun control. This is working, and that's why I think it's quite bizarre to be lectured on this by societies which have far worse problems in these respects.
Charlie Wolf, do you want to reply?
No, I still go by my original argument. I just, see the necessity. I would like to know that if I choose, I could protect myself in this country. I found it amazing. There was a story a couple of years ago, these rumors that supposedly David Beckham, his children were going to be, they were targets for kidnap. And what I found amazing was that in this country, even if someone like David Beckham, with all the money he has, couldn't call a security firm that was armed to protect, had to rely on the state for this. And waste their resources and have the resources of his own, is not in a position to say, yeah, I'd like to hire a bunch of ex-SAS guys, highly trained, know what they're doing. Can't be done in this country. And I think that's a shame we don't have the rights to full protection if we so choose it.
Ian Dunn, could we not implement that and just not increase the number of officers that being routinely armed?
I'd be extremely hesitant to just see military units privately employed on the streets of Britain to deal with it. I mean, no, I would be resolutely opposed to anything of the sort.
What are your concerns?
Well, privately employed militias sounds like a disastrous thing to apply to. Okay, a former military unit. I mean, they sound like paramilitaries. I mean, if they're former SAS, they'd be privately employed paramilitaries. It sounds much more like something that would happen in Colombia than something that would happen in Britain.
No, I mean, I'm talking about security firms that would be using people that had served in the military and are highly trained. So again, one of the concerns is you're saying people aren't trained enough. These would be highly trained people that know. And again, we're not sending them into battle, obviously, but I find it amazing that I don't have the right to protect myself if I so choose to do so.
Well, you have the right to protect yourself under British law. The quote is reasonable force. That's what you're allowed to use, and that to me seems like the most ideal word. Really, what that word does is just shove the situation towards the courts, where the court can decide if what you've done is reasonable. I mean, I can't think of a better way of framing a law.
But if the guy that comes into my corner shop has a sawn-off shotgun, I can't get to that level that's reasonable to protect myself. I'm going to go after him with a baseball bat.
I think at the heart of a lot of this debate is an idea of how much do you trust the police? And it's almost as if sort of talking to people who are sort of pro giving them more guns, there's this view of they're always the good guys. It's almost this sort of children's story. The truth is the police are necessary to protect us from each other, but they are also the most dangerous organization in human history. They are the hand of the state. They are what controls you as an individual. And we should be very careful before we decide to give them more weapons or more powers, because it's that civilization is based on, how to properly limit the role of the police while keeping ourselves safe.
How do you think the public would react? We've obviously but the British police were invented by Robert Peel to be this kind of policing by consent. How would they feel if it was now policing by force?
I think the British public, despite what we're saying about we won't faint and swoon when we see guns, I actually think the British public have one of the greatest luxuries in the world, and that is that they are still shocked by the sight of a gun. It is not something that they are used to. And you could come up with, that should be in any Brit's top 10 things that they're proudest of about their country. And there is this idea that we do police by consent. You can see how much goodwill there is towards the police after this murder happened, and that comes on the back of 2 weeks that have been very difficult for the police, with evidence of a Hillsborough cover-up and also, the Simon Harwood, the police officer who struck Ian Tomlinson in the G20 demo shortly before he died. It's been a tough few weeks in terms of PR for the police, but still you get this wave of goodwill towards them when this happens. I think that's indicative of a public affection for the system of policing by consent.
We have a public... I mean, you would have seen the same scenes in the United States, and I assume from our other guests you'd have seen the same things in the streets of Russia if a couple cops had been gunned down in such a fashion. The only difference I see sometimes between the police here and the police I saw in the United States and I don't mean this necessarily disrespectfully, I see sometimes, and not as much today as it was in times past, but there's almost a fecklessness in the sense that I remember once seeing, I was at a party once, and it was getting a bit out of hand, and the police showed up, and this party, the person in charge, more or less told the police to get lost and had every right to do, and the police could do nothing until they came back, I think, 15, 20 minutes with a couple van loads. And it just struck me at the time as someone who was new in the country, thinking, they'd never get away with that in my country. If the police showed up, you don't fear the police, but you have a respect for the police because they're enforcing the law of the land.
On that note, we're going to have to end today's discussion. Thank you to all of my guests: Charlie Wolfe, the American broadcaster; Ian Dunt, the editor of politics.co.uk; Peter Squires from the University of Brighton; and Maxim Popienka, a firearms expert from World Guns.
We have very few firearms in the street. We actually have a very low homicide rate. It would be a tragedy for us to overreact to individual cases and to start destabilizing that gunless society that Britain has. Really, when you don't have a population with very many guns, one of the problems, of course, when you give the police guns is they take on this much more oppressive image, and it adds up to a pretty unhealthy political environment.
And Charlie Wolfe?
I would disagree. I think not immediately. I couldn't see them issuing 10,000 handguns tomorrow to the entire force who haven't been trained and know how to handle them. But I think new incoming officers, as they are being trained, going to the police academy, the police training academy, they should be learning how to use firearms, and this should be slowly integrated in, because a policeman, as I would even argue a citizen, and I know that's not the discussion today, but should have the right to protect themselves, to have the tools available when an assailant.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner. In In this debate, we'll be discussing whether or not the British police force should routinely carry arms. A vigil has been held for the two female police officers shot dead in Manchester on the 18th of September. WPCs Fiona and Nicole Hughes, who were both unarmed, died from gunshot wounds in an attack still under investigation. Their deaths have renewed calls for the British police force to be routinely issued firearms. But those calls were countered by the Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg, who warned against any knee-jerk response to the tragedy. Mr. Clegg said the move had considerable risks and could damage relations between police and the community. But the widower of another murdered WPC, Sharon Beshenivsky, says officers should carry firearms so they were prepared for any situation. In the last decade, fewer than 10 British police officers have been shot in the course of duty. Well, joining me for today's discussion is Charlie Wolfe, an American broadcaster who blogs for the Daily Mail. Ian Dunt is the editor of politics.co.uk. Joining us on the phone is Peter Squires, a professor of criminology and public policy at the University of Brighton and also a co-author of Shooting to Kill, Policing Firearms and Armed Response. And we're also joined by Maxim Popienka, a firearms expert from the website World Guns. Ian Dunn, editor of politics.co.uk. Should police officers be routinely armed?
No, very much not. I think we actually have an extremely fortunate situation in this country.
History there was event that actually started with chain of limitation in firearm ownership, and back in the start of the 20th century, a group of criminals, heavily armored criminals in London, held against unarmed British police. Actually, police officer has to borrow rifles and sidearms from average citizens to fight the criminals. And
we'll go to Peter Squires as well, the Professor of Criminology and Public Policy at the University of Brighton. What are your thoughts about whether police officers should be routinely issued firearms?
Well, I think the debate so far is quite bizarre. We've got two societies, representative two societies, with much higher crime rates, with many more guns, much more violent gun crime, telling us we need to arm our police. And the last speaker has talked about a situation over 100 years ago. It's quite peculiar. First of all, no, I don't think the police should arm themselves. I think we have a very high...
Someone they come into is armed. You don't have the time to wait for someone from the armed response unit to show up, or even again as a citizen, sometimes for the police to show up. You should be able to fight fire with fire when it is needed.
Maxim Popienka, firearms expert from the website World Guns.
Police should not be concerned about their image. They should be concerned first and most on their function, on the function of protecting people, especially from violent crimes. And violent people, violent criminals are not afraid of using firearms. So police must have means, adequate means, to stop the criminals at any possible moment, not waiting for some special team to arrive, because wait would mean lost lives in most cases. You remember in British